On Christmas Day 1914, something truly remarkable happened across the sodden, cratered Western Front. The relentless cacophony of artillery and the staccato rhythm of machine gun fire fell silent. Soldiers cautiously emerged from their trenches. They were young men, British, French, Belgian, German. In the eerie quiet of no man's land, they began to fraternize. They shared tobacco, they shared chocolate, they shared schnapps. They sang carols together, their voices mingling in the cold air. These unofficial ceasefires held in pockets along the lines, from the Belgian coast to the Swiss border. Soldiers exchanged buttons from their uniforms as souvenirs. They organized football matches in the frozen mud between the trenches. They even held joint burial services for their fallen comrades. High command on both sides was horrified. Generals, politicians, stern orders forbidding any fraternization were issued. By Boxing Day, and certainly by the New Year, the artillery began to roar once more. But the memory of that Christmas Day lingered, a haunting what if. It showed that the men fighting were not monsters, but ordinary individuals. While it failed to end the conflict, its legacy endures as a symbol of hope. It forces us to consider the alternative possibilities, what might have been forged from the mud and mire of the Western Front. When the great powers of Europe plunged into war in August 1914, the prevailing mood was not one of dread, but of a strange, almost festive excitement. Across the continent, vast crowds cheered as their young men marched off to the front. London, Paris, Berlin. The dominant belief was that the conflict would be a swift and decisive affair. The popular slogan of the day, "The boys will be home by Christmas," was not mere wishful thinking. It sprang from 19th century military doctrines and experiences. Germany's famous Schlieffen Plan aimed to knock France out in 6 weeks by sweeping through Belgium, then turn to Russia. The French believed in élan vital, the fighting spirit, and expected bright uniforms to carry them to victory. Recent wars like the Franco-Prussian War of 1870–71 reinforced the illusion of speed. Military leaders prepared to fight the last war. They envisioned grand cavalry charges, sweeping infantry advances, not the grim reality of trench warfare. Armies mobilized in the millions, unprecedented scale. Sustaining offensives proved far harder than expected, leading to exhausted troops and overstretched supply lines. As autumn leaves fell in 1914, the initial optimism began to curdle into a grim realization. The machine gun, the rapid-firing artillery piece, barbed wire trenches had created an almost unbreakable defensive stalemate. The war of movement was over. A hideous war of attrition had begun. The promise of being home by Christmas was exposed as a hollow, tragic fantasy. A cruel joke on a generation trapped in a deadly quagmire with no easy escape. The primary reason the war did not end by Christmas 1914 can be summarized in a single word: stalemate. After the initial German advance was dramatically halted at the First Battle of the Marne in September, the conflict on the Western Front transformed. Both sides tried to outflank each other in what became known as the race to the sea, and then they began digging in. What started as simple ditches and foxholes rapidly evolved into vast, complex networks of trenches stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss Alps. This trench system became the defining feature of a new, static form of warfare, one that heavily favored the defender and made a decisive breakthrough almost impossible to achieve. This military deadlock was reinforced by political will and entrenched nationalism. In the capitals of Europe, the idea of a compromise peace was anathema. Having already sacrificed tens of thousands of lives and vast national treasure, leaders on both sides felt they had passed a point of no return. For the Allies, the German invasion of neutral Belgium and the occupation of northern France were unforgivable transgressions that had to be reversed. For Germany, anything less than a victory securing status and influence would be a humiliating defeat. Furthermore, the strategic objectives of the major powers were fundamentally irreconcilable. France was absolutely determined to reclaim Alsace-Lorraine and to break the threat of German militarism once and for all. Great Britain had entered the war to restore Belgian neutrality and to maintain the balance of power in Europe by curbing Germany's rising naval ambitions and imperial ambitions. The German Empire sought to establish its place in the sun, demanding colonial concessions and economic dominance over the continent. With such diametrically opposed goals, there was simply no middle ground for diplomats to find. The very nature of the alliance systems created a complex web of obligations. The Entente, Britain, France, Russia, and the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, were bound by treaties and mutual self-interest. If one member sought a separate peace, it would expose the others to overwhelming pressure. This meant the war had become an all-or-nothing contest. The industrial might and the economic might of entire empires was now fully mobilized, creating a relentless war machine that, once set in motion, was incredibly difficult to stop. The war had taken on a grim, unstoppable momentum of its own. For the war to have concluded by Christmas 1914 with a clear military victory, one scenario stands out as the most plausible: the success of Germany's Schlieffen Plan. In this alternate timeline, the German First Army, under General von Kluck, adheres rigidly to the original strategy. Instead of turning east of Paris to engage the French army, a move that exposed its flank and led to the miracle of the Marne, it continues its great wheeling motion to the west of the French capital and to the south of the French capital. This maneuver successfully encircles the bulk of the French forces and the British Expeditionary Force, trapping them against the Swiss border. The fall of Paris would have been an immense psychological and strategic blow, likely in early October. With its government in flight and its primary armies either captured or in disarray, the French will to continue the fight would have been shattered. The Third Republic would have had little choice but to sue for peace. The British Expeditionary Force, cut off and hopelessly outnumbered, would have been forced into a humiliating surrender or a desperate Dunkirk-style evacuation from Western French ports. With France defeated, the war on the Western Front would effectively be over. Germany would impose harsh peace terms on France, certainly annexing more territory beyond Alsace-Lorraine, perhaps the Longwy-Briey Iron Basin, to cripple French industry. Belgium would be reduced to a German satellite state, its neutrality permanently erased. Kaiser Wilhelm II and his generals would be hailed as heroes in Berlin, their belief in Prussian militarism vindicated. Germany would have achieved its long-desired hegemony over continental Europe, its status as the world's preeminent land power now undisputed. With the Western Front secured, Germany could then turn its undivided attention eastward. A swift German-Austrian offensive in the spring of 1915 would likely force the Tsar to the negotiating table, leading to huge territorial losses in Poland, the Baltics and Ukraine. The war would be over, a stunning and rapid victory for the Central Powers, and Christmas 1914 would be celebrated in a Berlin that stood as the undisputed master of Europe. A second, more subtle path to a Christmas peace would not involve a decisive battle, but a moment of collective, pragmatic realization among the political elites. Let's imagine, after the Battle of the Marne and the subsequent entrenchment, a profound sense of shock and disillusionment sets in far more quickly than historically. Key figures in Berlin, particularly civilian leaders like Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg, pore over casualty lists and the reality of a two-front war with utter dread. They conclude the Schlieffen Plan has failed, and that a prolonged war of attrition would bankrupt the nation and risk social revolution. Simultaneously in Paris and in London, the initial patriotic fervour cools into a sober assessment of the costs. Instead of doubling down, pragmatic diplomats and politicians begin to quietly explore a status quo antebellum peace, a return to the borders and conditions from before August. This process could be initiated through neutral intermediaries: the United States under President Woodrow Wilson, the Pope, the King of Spain. The key would be allowing each side to save face. Germany could spin a withdrawal from Belgium and France not as a defeat, but as a magnanimous gesture to restore peace, perhaps in exchange for a minor colonial concession from France in Africa. France could claim victory by having defended its territory. Britain could declare its primary aim, Belgian sovereignty, achieved. A peace treaty signed in December 1914 would be immensely controversial. Hardliners and nationalists would decry it as a betrayal. The generals would be furious at being denied total victory, but the majority, weary of casualties and economic disruption, would feel overwhelming relief. Soldiers would genuinely be home for Christmas, and the great powers would, for a moment, have stepped back from the brink. Had the Great War ended by Christmas of 1914, the great multi-ethnic and colonial empires of the world would have been granted a significant, though maybe not permanent, lease on life. The war, in our timeline, was really the engine of their destruction, bleeding them of men and money, undermining their prestige, and unleashing forces of nationalism and self-determination. A short war would have avoided this cataclysmic outcome. The British Empire, far from being mortally wounded, would emerge with their global power structures largely intact. The French Empire, far from being mortally wounded, would emerge with their global power structures largely intact. They would not have incurred the crippling debts that hastened their decline. They would not have suffered the generational loss of life that hastened their decline. The continental empires of the Central and Eastern powers would also survive, though their internal frailties would still be simmering beneath the surface. The German Empire would remain a powerful semi-authoritarian monarchy. The Austro-Hungarian Empire might have muddled through for another generation. The Ottoman Empire would not have been dismembered by the Allies. Syria would have remained under Ottoman control. Iraq would have remained under Ottoman control. Palestine would have remained under Ottoman control. Life within the colonies would change far more slowly. The immense contribution of colonial troops and resources just wouldn't have occurred on the same scale. India's independence movement would continue to grow, but without the war's catalyst. African independence movements would continue to grow, but without the war's catalyst. Southeast Asian independence movements would continue to grow, but without the war's catalyst. The European empires would be in a much stronger position to suppress dissent. The old world order of 1914, with Europe at its centre, would persist well into the 20th century. Great power competition would remain a guiding mentality. Colonialism would remain entrenched. The sense of moral and cultural superiority that underpinned the imperial project would remain unshaken. The empires would continue their great game of competition for influence and resources, unaware that the seeds of future, maybe even greater conflicts were still being sown. It is deeply tempting to believe that a peace signed at Christmas of 1914 would have saved the world from future conflict. But this is an optimistic and honestly likely flawed assumption. The peace would have been fragile, more of an armistice rather than a true resolution. All the underlying causes of the war would remain firmly in place: the intricate web of alliances, the rampant militarism, the intense imperial rivalries, the fervent nationalism. The war would not have been the war to end all wars, but merely a dress rehearsal, a brief, bloody episode that failed to provide the horrifying lesson that our timeline received. The great powers would have simply paused to lick their wounds, rearm, and learn from their tactical mistakes. In the scenario of a German victory, a resentful and humiliated France would be consumed by a desire for revenge, just as it was after 1871, but with even greater intensity. Britain would view the German-dominated continent as an existential threat to its empire, and would undoubtedly begin a massive naval and military build-up, seeking new alliances to contain German power. This would create a tense Cold War-style standoff across Europe, with a heavily armed and paranoid Germany trying to maintain its hegemony against a coalition determined to dismantle it. A second, even larger war would not be a question of if, but when. Even in the case of a negotiated peace, the outcome would be unstable. Every nation would have a powerful political faction arguing that they had been betrayed and that a true victory had been stolen from them. The generals would lobby for more funding, promising that with new weapons and better strategies, they could achieve a decisive result next time. The arms race, particularly between the British and German navies, would resume with renewed vigour. The competition for colonies in Africa and Asia would continue, providing numerous flashpoints for a future conflict to ignite, perhaps far from the fields of Europe, but inevitably drawing the great powers back into a global confrontation. Ultimately, the Great War of our history, for all its unparalleled horror, served as a brutal form of shock therapy for the world. It demonstrated the suicidal nature of industrialized warfare between great powers and discredited the romantic 19th century notions of war as a glorious political tool. A short conflict would have failed to teach this lesson. The old lie that it is sweet and fitting to die for one's country would not have been so thoroughly exposed. A world where peace broke out in December of 1914 would be an unrecognizably different place, a 20th century that remained in many ways an extension of the 19th. For the ordinary person, the most immediate impact would be survival. An entire generation of young men, the poets, the artists, the leaders, the laborers, would not be lost in the trenches. This demographic preservation would have profound social and cultural consequences. Families would remain whole, societies spared the deep wounds of mass bereavement. The pace of social change would likely be slower. The Great War acted as a powerful catalyst, accelerating movements like women's suffrage as a reward for their vital home front contributions. Without the crucible of long, total war, the push for female empowerment and the breakdown of rigid class structures would proceed much more gradually. Medical and technological advances, often spurred by war, plastic surgery, aviation, would follow a less urgent trajectory. The world would feel more traditional, more hierarchical, less modern for longer. Globally, the map would look profoundly different. The Middle East would not be carved into the fractious states we know today. The Ottoman Empire would likely persist, controlling territory from Anatolia to the Arabian Peninsula. Self-determination would not become a guiding principle. Struggles for independence in Ireland, India, Africa would face a much steeper path. The violent birth of the Soviet Union and the spread of communism would be avoided, fundamentally altering the century's political landscape. In the end, A Christmas Peace is deeply ambivalent. It spares the specific horrors of the trenches, the Holocaust, Cold War nuclear brinkmanship. It is a world where millions who died would have lived, loved, built futures. Yet the great, arrogant empires of the 19th century would march on, their sicknesses uncured. The brutal lessons about nationalism, militarism, the catastrophic cost of industrial warfare would remain unlearned. This gentler world might simply be postponing its reckoning, destined to stumble into a different unknown cataclysm.